it would be extremely politically costly to do anything about this particular one. And I quote here the economist Arnold Kling, who says, a regulatory crackdown would have meant taking away a punch bowl filled with more home ownership, particularly among minorities, as well as expansion and profits in the businesses of home building, real estate brokerage, mortgage origination, and Wall Street financial engineering. Well, that's just not going to happen. And then also, we had this so-called prudential regulation to keep the banks from doing crazy things. And so they had these regulations that said the safer the assets you're holding, the less you have to keep in reserve as capital. So the way it worked was for every $100 you've got in standard loans, you've got to keep $10 in capital. For every $100 you have in mortgages, you have to keep only $5 in capital. And for every $100 you have in AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities, you have to keep only $2 in capital. So take a wild guess at which asset class everybody and his uncle fled into, right? Everybody goes into this. So then the thing collapses, and now it's all the worse. Because this type of regulatory apparatus almost mandates herd behavior. Instead of a normal situation where people would have been diversified into a variety of asset classes, everybody's in this. And then we're told, okay, but didn't we have poor management of major financial institutions? Well, no doubt about that. That's why you need to have failure. You have to allow them to fail. The same bozos don't keep doing the same thing. You've got to read David Stockman on that, the former Reagan budget director, on the myth of TARP. You know, we all would have gone into a black hole, never to be heard from again if it weren't for this and all that. He makes mincemeat of that. You can Google TARP and Stockman. But okay, so we got this bad leadership. But what we don't hear about is that the current regulatory environment makes it very difficult to do anything about the bad leadership. So insurance companies, pension funds, mutual funds, and banks are simply not allowed to hold more than a very small stake in a particular company. Hedge funds and private equity investors are restricted by regulations that prevent them from acquiring a controlling interest in a bank holding company. But these are the institutions that have a stake in keeping an eye on management and keeping wayward management in line. We're supposed to sit back and hope that regulators who have zero stake in this, they're going to get their salary no matter what. They might get a raise if they don't perceive it in time. It's because they were being deprived of a good salary. We've got to pay them more. Maybe that's not the most promising model. But because of this government policy, stockholders of these institutions are artificially disorganized and scattered, and management enjoys artificial protection that it would not enjoy on a free market. Okay, now a further point about this myth of government is that it causes us to lose our imagination. We begin to think once government does something, we can't think of any way it could be done otherwise. And this is why Murray Rothbard used to say, imagine if the government produced and distributed shoes. And then somebody proposed, well, why don't we privatize shoe production? We would never hear the end of this. What? Well, I mean, people have all different sized feet. How would we ever provide for that? Maybe a private company would produce only left-foot shoes. I mean, we think of the most convoluted, ridiculous. I mean, it's incredible how little dignity we allow ourselves to have. How helpless we think we'd be. Why would a company produce only left-handed shoes, left-foot shoes? Why? They have no interest in doing that. Why would they want to do that? But it's the same sort of thing. If you propose privatizing something, he'll immediately resist. No, we couldn't live without this government funding. So, for example, if you're against government funding for the arts, this makes you an opponent of the arts, period, apparently. So, we think there would be no arts without government funding. You terrible Philistine, you want to cut government funding. And yet, okay, well, just look at it. Look at the National Endowment for the Arts, okay? What do they get, a couple of $100 million bucks? But private donations to the arts amount in the billions of dollars. So, we, in our own activities, have already refuted this myth. We just don't know it. And incidentally, I live in Kansas, and the governor, Sam Brownback, is trying to eliminate the Kansas Arts Council, or whatever it's called, and try to encourage private investors donors to fill the gap. And my wife and I once went to a theater in rural Kansas, the Columbian Theater, and we got this email. I'm on their list, and they were panicked. They said, "This is terrible. Brownback is going to take our money away. Do you know every year we get $5,000 from the state?" So they have become so pathetic, they have so little creativity, so little imagination, they think they couldn't have a bake sale and raise the $5,000. I'll give you the $5,000. If I knew that was the difference between you and closing your door, I'll give you the $5,000. $5,000? I mean, that's like one, jogathon thing. You get whatever, a raffle. I mean, this is pathetic that we think this way. But I want to take on a harder case. Okay, enough of this easy stuff like poverty in the arts and regulation. Let's take on science, right? If it weren't for, and then, so of course, all the left-wing hate sites as soon as this airs. You can just imagine what Media Matters will, which always goes after me. They can't actually answer anything I'm saying, by the way. And my biography is at tomwoods.com, which they never link to, because then you might see, well, he's got some credentials. Can't do that. So all the thought control sites will go after me. Crazy Neanderthal is against government science funding. Well, okay, but look, I actually have arguments for this, and I'm going to share them with you now. And it's basically this. Let's take, for example, Britain in the 19th century. Britain was the most wealthy, industrialized country in the world, home to some of its most illustrious scientists. And you know how much government science funding there was? 0. Meanwhile, France and Germany spent boatloads on science through the government and fell way behind. Now, let's again do a thought experiment. Suppose it were reversed. Suppose Britain had spent all the money and then did very well, and France and Germany had spent nothing and then did badly. We would never hear the end of it. Aha! It goes to show the difference between good science and no science at all is government funding. But when the opposite, when once again, as usual, reality defies what the statists tell us, we just hear silence. It just never comes up. People don't even know about it. Japan's civil research and development is the most privatized in the world. And yet Japan engages in an enormous amount of what's called basic science, which supposedly the free market would never provide. Basic science, because it doesn't yield immediate profits, and the fruits of it could just be stolen by a competitor, so why would the free market ever provide it? But it does. It takes place in Japan in industrial laboratories instead of in tax-funded universities. We have bought into this false notion of science, I think ever since Francis Bacon, centuries ago, that scientific progress supposedly runs like this. We have basic science, scientists just sort of working in a laboratory. And that gives rise to discoveries, which then in turn are adopted by private entities, which put them in the service of human welfare. Now that is a plausible story. I believe that for a long time. But that's actually not how science has in fact progressed. What normally happens, in fact, is that applied science builds on applied science, not on basic science. Classic example of this is the steam engine. The steam engine did not emerge from scientists in lab coats. It wasn't that some guy was in a lab somewhere experimenting, and all of a sudden he said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I got like a steam engine over here." This is not the case. It was practical men adapting pre-existing technology to modern problems. In fact, the science had to adapt to the technology because the steam engine was actually more efficient than existing science said it could be. So the science had to change. The Department of Defense years ago looked into how many of the 700 key research breakthroughs that led to the development of important weapons systems were attributable to basic science. And the answer was 2 out of the 700. So applied science built overwhelmingly on applied science. But the point is that even basic science is supplied more by the free market than it is by governments. If you look at percentage of GDP, it's no contest. Private donors way outspent governments in the age before the estate tax decimated incomes. And Terence Keeley explains this in his great book, The Economic Laws of Scientific Research. It's unfortunately very hard to find that book. I summarize it a bit in my own here. And then, moreover, we could just go on. There's a lot more evidence and rationales of why we should expect this to be the case. In fact, he makes a very cogent argument that government funding will always displace more than it replaces. So there will be less overall spending on science. And this is very counterintuitive. But as I say, I give more support to it in the course of the book. Now let's take on a couple more toughies here. I want to say, now obviously I can't take on the whole regulatory apparatus. I mean, this is like require a whole revolution in our thinking. But what I do just want to do is just raise some ideas for reflection. Just throw out some facts that a lot of people just don't perhaps know. It's not to say that we don't need any oversight of various things. It's just what form does that oversight take? And what sort of agency in our society engages in it? But take, for example, OSHA, occupational safety and health. Well, what would be the typical narrative about that? Well, before OSHA, everybody's dying on the job because people are standing there on the assembly line, and it's so unsafe that they're falling into the grinder, and then we're eating hot dogs made out of a guy's leg. We get that constantly. We got that in the Upton Sinclair book and all that. Okay, but in fact, first of all, 60% of the injuries on the job are nothing that an employer could do anything about. By and large, like 20% of them are like violence on the job, like people beating each other up. Well, once that happens, it's already going on. Not much you can do about it. And then another 40%, and so adding up to the 60% is traffic fatalities, during, you're on the highway or something. So these are not the classic things that we've been led to think of when we think about workplace fatalities. But we don't know this. People say, hey, look, we got OSHA, and then look what happens. Workplace fatalities decline, and injuries and so on. But the point is they were already declining at an even faster rate before we got that thing. Now, that's not to say, maybe OSHA accelerated it or whatever. Again, okay, we talk a little bit more about that in the book, but the point is, I bet most people didn't even realize that progress is already being made because the wealthier the society becomes, the more desirable and possible it becomes to bring about safer environments. That's just the natural part of the evolution of society. Or the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Surely this must be the reason that we're seeing there being fewer fatalities every year on the highways. 3.5% a year it's going down. But you know what? In the 35 years before we had that agency, at what rate fatalities were going down? 3.5% a year. Now again, we don't hear anything. Not a word. This is entirely due to your wise overlords, and you'd all be dead without them, so shut your mouths. No, I'm just not buying this. And then also, there are countless examples of how the private sector, the bad part of the private sector, uses the regulatory apparatus to its own advantage to hurt its competitors. Just think about, for example, anytime there's some industry where there's some government move to ban advertising in that industry, who's advocating that? The biggest established firms, of course. It doesn't hurt them. Everybody already knows about Marlboro. Nobody knows about Joe's Cigarette Company. Okay, kids, if you're watching, don't smoke. But you see my point, right? You see the logic of it, is that we tend to think, gosh, what a wonderful public-spirited measure this is. Well, you know what? That's kind of rare, actually. It's usually, there's a reason that the most free market political candidates on the national level tend not to get a huge amount of money from big business. It tends to be the case. Because they kind of like the system the way it is now. They're perfectly happy with it the way it is now. So these regulatory bodies very often prop up the established firms, and meanwhile, we have gullible people who think, gosh, where would we be without them? So just one example of this. For a long time, we were told that we have to avoid cutthroat competition. And cutthroat competition just means lowering prices for people. So that has to be treated as the devil. That's like Godzilla. We don't want that. And so in the name of doing this, every major innovation in retailing over the past more than 100 years was fought tooth and nail by existing firms precisely on these grounds. Well, if we had this innovation, it would lead to cutthroat competition. No, it means I would have to get off my lazy you-know-what and work harder to compete with my competitor who's having a sale. So, for example, when we hear about, this is kind of dated these days, but we used to hear jokes about traveling salesmen. The poor traveling salesman, he was the butt of so many jokes. Talk about a misunderstood poor soul, the traveling salesman. Why did people make jokes about the traveling salesman? And I derived this from some work by Murray Rothbard. Well, okay, the traveling salesman was not liked by a lot of wholesalers because he could get into a town, visit every retailer, and show off his wares, and then get out and win their business. And of course, the established way of doing things doesn't like that. How dare he? Who does he think he is? So the established firms moved to get heavy licensing fees imposed on traveling salesmen. which they couldn't afford to pay. If I'm going to go into this town, I have to pay this fee. So what they would do is they would sneak into town, go to each retail store really quickly, hey, here's my stuff, and then get out before they could be detected. And so because they were operating sort of on the edges of legality, people began to think of them as being slightly underhanded and perverse, even though it seems more underhanded and perverse to make them do this, right, of course. But as usual, our wise overlords are guiltless, and it's the terrible, traveling salesmen that have to go after. Or department stores. My gosh, department stores were treated like the return of Godzilla when they were introduced. Department stores. How dare these institutions sell multiple products? And to add insult to injury, they're doing it on different floors. Who do these people think? And then mail order. Mail order? You're just going to send out a Sears Roebuck catalog and I got my whole storefront here? And so people were encouraged to have large bonfires of the Sears Roebuck catalog, the great enemy of society. Or then it was, whatever, the chain stores, but then it was the discount houses. Now this is great. For a long time, there were rules in some of the states that a retailer cannot sell a product for less than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Because if they did so, that would be cutthroat competition and da-da-da-da-da. Well, obviously, we all know who was pushing for this law. The retailers, obviously. It was not the general public saying, oh, I'm so sick and tired of sales. Could you please stop marking things down? Oh, horrible. No, of course it was the retailers themselves. But by the 1950s, the heroic discount houses popped up, where they were going to offer you the low-priced goods, marking them off the manufacturer's suggested retail price in defiance of the law. And at first people didn't know what to say, like the establishment was all ruffled. Who are these people? These discount houses. You should read, I quoted in Rollback, an article from Life magazine, horrified at the discount houses. Because at the discount houses, they're not waiting on you hand and foot. Like you don't go into them and say, why, I need a fan, please. Oh, yes, sir, I'll take you to the fan section. No. If you have a question, they'll answer it. But that was how they kept their prices low. And okay, so they didn't always sweep the aisles. So Life magazine is going, oh, they have unswept aisles, and people are rude in there. I mean, like they couldn't compute that this sort of thing. So a lot of times, these discount houses were hauled into court, injunctions were brought against them, you've got to stop doing this, but finally it just became impossible to deal with it. And so today we have this heroic situation where today we look at the manufacturer's suggested retail price and we think, what sucker is paying this thing? It's the heroic discount houses who stood up against this use of the apparatus of coercion and compulsion, namely the state, to benefit certain institutions at the expense of others. All right, well, let's see how I'm doing. Okay, I was told I still continue with my regular time, so I am going to take advantage of that. I will just say very quickly, I wanted to say a little bit more about it, but I'm going to truncate things a bit, that even when we get to something like national defense, even here, there is reason for skepticism. And I say this as somebody who years ago I would have thought, if you say that the military budget should also be on the table, but when you're talking about budget cuts, well, you must, what kind of commie? Go back to Russia, you commie. That would have been my response. But then the more I've read about it, the more I think, well, wait a minute, now I feel like I'm being taken advantage of here. Like now I feel like, my former patriotism is now being exploited by people, and that's just not right. And so, for example, there's a lot of military analysts who've been around the Pentagon for years say this, that we've got this problem of the missing $1 trillion over the past roughly like 9 or 10 years. Like since 9/11, the Pentagon budget went up by a couple $1 trillion, and half of that went to the wars. But the question is, what happened to the other half? That's what a lot of like Winslow Wheeler and a lot of people who are not left liberals at all, they're asking, where did the other $1 trillion go? And the reason they're asking that is that when you look at the state of things, like you look, they see that the combat air fleet is weighed down by like 51% when it's got I think down by 43%, got a 51% budget increase. How can that be? How can the number of battle force ships in the Navy be down by 15%? Or the Army is up trivially, but the Army's budget is up substantially. Like, how could this be? Where is the money going? And the institution, this is the one cabinet department that's not subject to audit. It's explicitly exempted from audit. So it's not to say that they failed the audit. It's that we don't even know. We don't know, have contractors been paid once, twice, or not at all? Nobody knows. We don't know this. But we're sort of told, well, you can't mention that because that means you hate America or something. No. I mean, I say this would be like the most important thing to look at. And then, moreover, there have been economic consequences of all this. And one of the points I make is there are certain incentives that a private firm faces on the free market. Those incentives are you've got to keep your costs low, and you've got to keep the quality of your product super high. But these are not always the incentives that firms are operating under when their client or their major client becomes the Pentagon, because although money is an issue, it's not like they could just spend like a quintillion dollars on something, but they'll get the money one way or another. More concerned is how well can you work with the military community? How well can you deal with the fact that we may be changing the design on you very frequently? I mean, this is a much greater concern. So a number of scholars have noted that the business model of these firms becomes, instead of cost minimization, becomes cost and subsidy maximization. So that once they then go back to the private sector, they've almost forgotten how to be a competitive firm again. And an example of this is what happened to the U.S. machine tool industry, which was the envy of the world as recently as the 1960s. And then the Pentagon became its chief customer. And so we have first that a lot of the great research and development minds are being siphoned off into the government sector. And there's nobody replacing them. There's only a fixed number of geniuses. Some of them are doing this. They can't be doing R&D work. But also, the incentives they're operating under were very unhealthy. So that by the late 60s, the big thing was numerical control machine tool technology. And the Japanese developed it inexpensively. The Germans developed it inexpensively. The U.S. machine tool industry developed it, but so expensively that no private sector firm could buy it. And this has been suggested, this is because they're operating under a whole... Now, the Pentagon could buy it, and did, but they're operating under completely different incentives. I mean, these are issues that need to be considered. All this stuff has to be on the table. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is more than just about spending or balanced budgets or debt. Ultimately, it is about right and wrong. And here I want to close, but it's a long close, so I'm building up to something. Okay? I want to close with a little story from Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick, the late Robert Nozick, was a Harvard philosopher who wrote a book in 1974, won a bunch of awards, called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And I want to read to you, well, these are going to be my words, but they're his ideas. I want to read to you his Tale of the Slave. And it goes through 9 stages, but they're very short. The Tale of the Slave runs like this. First, and he invites all of us to consider ourselves as the slave in the story. First stage, you are a slave at the mercy of a brutal master who forces you to work for his purposes and beats you arbitrarily. Second, the master decides to beat you only for breaking the rules and even grants you some free time. Third, you are part of a group of slaves subject to this master. He decides, on grounds acceptable to everyone, how goods should be allocated among you all. Fourth, the master requires his slaves to work only 3 days per week, granting them the other 4 days off. They can do as they wish during their free time. Fifth, the master now allows the slaves to work wherever they wish. His main caveat is that they must send him 3/7 of their wages, corresponding to the 3 days' worth of work they once had to do on his land every week. In an emergency, he can force them to do his bidding once again, and he retains the power to alter the fraction of their wages to which he lays claim. Sixth, the master grants all 10,000 of his slaves, except you, the right to vote. They can decide among themselves how much of their and your earnings to take and what outlets to fund with the money. They can decide what you are and are not allowed to do. We can suppose, for the sake of argument, that the master irrevocably grants this right to the 10,000 slaves. You now have 10,000 masters or a single 10,000-headed master. Seventh, you are granted the freedom to try to persuade the 10,000 to exercise their vast powers in a particular way. You still do not have the right to vote, but you can try to influence those who do. Eighth, the 10,000 grant you the right to vote, but only to break a tie. You write down your vote, and if a tie should occur, they open it and record it. No tie has ever occurred. Ninth, you are granted the right to vote, But functionally, it simply means, as in the 8th stage, that in case of a tie, which has never occurred, your vote carries the issue. Nozick's question is this: at what stage between 1 and 9 did this become something other than the tale of a slave? Well, that's an interesting unexamined question, because it is an unexamined premise of our society across the American political spectrum, that society cannot function without a single coercive institution with the power to dispose of the lives and fortunes of over 300 million individuals. While throwing the poor a few scraps in 1,001 open and covert ways, this institution enriches various elites at the expense of the productive population. The more it grows, the worse it gets. More and more sectors of society conclude they, too, must enrich themselves by means of government-granted privilege. Everyone begins to clamor for subsidies just in order to break even. The industrialists take, the farmers take, the scientists take, the military establishment takes, the social workers take, the education bureaucracy takes, everybody takes. All of this looting under cover of law is what Frederick Bastiat, the great 19th century French economist, memorably called legal plunder. No one considers it legitimate to stick a gun in his neighbor's ribs and take his things. Yet we are taught to believe that a dramatic moral difference separates that kind of open stealing with the indirect kind. In other words, when the government sticks a gun in your neighbor's ribs and hands the proceeds to you. Nozick put it like this: when you tax away from someone the fruits of 5 months of his labor, you are in effect taking away 5 months from him. You are taking away part of his life. Dance around the issue all you like, but this is forced labor by any reasonable definition of the term. Now, be honest, when I said Harvard philosopher, you weren't expecting it to turn out quite this well. But can this really... Is it so unimaginable to conceive of a society in which we finally put the guns down and deal with each other on the basis of reason and compassion rather than force? Bastiat once described the state as the great fictitious entity by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. Well, this arrangement is coming to an end. Something is going to have to give. We're facing fiscal collapse. We may be confronting a currency collapse in which the dollar's purchasing power will fall precipitously over the course of a short period of time. And then there won't be anything left for the poor or for the pressure groups or for anyone else except a bunch of worthless promises. And every year the crisis is not addressed, the situation becomes all the worse. So, in short, the propaganda with which we are flooded regarding how indispensable our wise overlords in Washington is, this is unworthy of a 6th grader. We would not die instantly were it not for the constant oversight of our overlords in Washington. We would flourish. And here's the proof. Thank you all very much.